Good evening. Welcome to the Majors and Quinn Facebook page and YouTube channel. My name is Annie, and I'm the events coordinator at Majors and Quinn Booksellers, which is an independent bookstore based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If this is your first virtual event with us, welcome. If it's your 7th, 10th, welcome back. Thank you so much for supporting our events program in all the forms it's taken over the past few years. If you are interested in purchasing any of the books that you hear about tonight, I will be dropping links to the Majors and Quinn website in the chat, particularly the new novel by Deborah Royce, Ruby Falls. But there will be some links for you to look at. And speaking of the chat, whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, that is where you should place any questions you have for the authors this evening. If you're on Facebook, just log into your Facebook account. YouTube, log into your YouTube account and use the live chat function. And that's how we'll take your questions this evening, and we'll do that at the end of the hour. Until then, we're going to be hearing a conversation about Ruby Falls between author Deborah Royce and Luanne Rice. And I am going to introduce them quickly to you and then get out of your hair so they can kick it off. So please allow me to introduce first Luanne Rice is the New York Times bestselling author of 36 novels, including 3 YA novels that have been translated into 27 languages. Luanne, thanks so much for being the conversation partner for this evening.
Thank you for having me.
And Deborah Royce made her debut as an author in 2019 with Finding Mrs. Ford, and of course now this new book, Ruby Falls. She was an actress in film and television for 10 years and is remembered by soap opera fans for her role as Silver Kane, sister of the legendary Erica Kane on ABC's All My Children. She later worked as a story editor for Miramax Films and was instrumental in the development of such films as Emma, The Englishman Who Went Up a Hill But Came Down a Mountain, and A Wrinkle in Time. With her husband, she restored and reopened the Ocean House Hotel in Watch Hill, Rhode Island, the Deer Mountain Inn in Tannersville, New York, and the Avon Theater, a 1939 landmark in Stamford, Connecticut. So many amazing talents from this woman. So please join me in welcoming to your screens Deborah Royce and Luanne Rice, and I will be back at the end of the hour to take questions.
Thank you, Annie. Hi, Luanne.
Hi, Deborah. So happy to see you.
And I can hardly see you because I couldn't operate my computer. And so you're on my phone. You look like an angel, sort of aura around you.
Thank you. You do too. I love seeing you in your home. Usually when we're together, we're on a stage in a bookstore or at the Ocean House. And it's just really nice to see you in your element.
That's one of the benefits of this crazy Zoom world. We do see little pieces of, I don't know if you watch PBS News, but what is her name? The reporter who through the whole pandemic would do her stories from her living room. And she had this gray sectional sofa in the background with a throw on it, Lisa Desjardins. And there was always her cat on this throw. And the cat would only ever occasionally move. And there were all these internet memes of Lisa Desjardins' cat.
Obviously, Orion heard that and he's wanting his own moment of stardom. So
yes.
I'm just so excited to be here to talk to you about Ruby Falls because, first of all, congratulations on the paperback release. I know that was just last week, right?
Yesterday.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so we're right on it. And I have my hardcover right here. Ruby Falls was my favorite book of 2021. And obviously the paperback is going to be my favorite paperback of 2022. It's just the most wonderful book. And for all of your fans from Finding Mrs. Ford, it continues in that wonderful character-driven and setting-rich way that you have. But this one there's so much about this, Deborah. I mean, there's such a psychological mystery to it, and just like the depth and the I mean, there's so much to talk about. And obviously, trauma has played a role in Eleanor's development in her character. And then maybe at some point we can also talk about this cover, which I think is one of the best book covers that actually does, I mean, just does unbelievable justice to this story. So
Well, let's start there. The cover is, it's a, you know, I think you and I are in a similar wavelength in the way we look at life and the world. And there are all the things we plan, and then there are the things we don't plan. And somehow, what ends up happening is some crazy combination of the two. And the story of that cover, there's a wonderful photographer by the name of Melanie Wilhide, and she has her MFA from Yale, and has had and still has a very serious and respectable life as a photographer. And at a certain point, she was in California, I think Pasadena or somewhere like that, preparing for a gallery show, and her computer was stolen, which was horrible because all of her work was on that computer. And she was just tearing out her hair. 3 weeks later, the police returned the computer to her. I have the paperback, it's harder to see. And
beautiful.
she spent forever trying to access her work on the computer because the thief had tried to, I always mix up wipe and swipe. I think he had tried to wipe her computer clean. And by the time she was able to gain access to the photographs, they came out like that, kind of sliced up and down in different ways.
Wow.
And she stared at these pictures, and she was so inspired that she created a whole new show around this thing that had happened to her pictures. And this photograph was not in the original trove of pictures that were stolen. It was one that she created after that happened. So I was working with an artist and a graphic designer. We had done the first book cover together. And the artist, Becky Ford, was really familiar with Melanie Wilhide. They'd been at Yale together. And we came across this picture. And I was a little nervous at first about having a real face on a cover, because I don't know if you want to associate a book with a particular face. When I read a book, I'm always imagining what people look like. But anyway, it just hands down became the undeniable favorite. And I think it's a really spot on telegraphing depiction of what is going on in that book. The heroine is fragmented, if you will.
It's true. And then once you read the book, the cover will be even more meaningful. It's very arresting. I mean, it's the kind of, I think it's a cover that you can't not pick up. And I know that at our dear bookstores locally, and it's always on the front table because I think it just draws you straight to it. I love it. And I just, looking at the paperback cover, the colors are really vivid. So I think that'll be great.
The colors are good, and the book won an award. If you know Zibby Owens, which of course you do, she's this wonderful Moms Don't Have Time to Read podcaster. The book won the Zibby Award for Best Plot Twist. So we incorporated a sticker because Sam's Club has purchased a lot of books, and we're hoping they hop off the shelves. But mostly we hope you buy them at independent bookstores like Majors and Quinn, I have to say.
Of course. But the fragmented aspect of it. So that is one of the things about this story that I think is so incredibly done. It starts off in the most tender and dramatic way with a little girl, 6 years old, Ruby, who's in a cave with her dad on an excursion, like a trip to, spelunk. And something happens, and I won't say it. You can if you think if you want to, but something happens that absolutely changes the course of Ruby's life and makes her who she is from 6 years old to when this book takes place. And it's so incredibly movingly done and terrifyingly done. I mean, it just sets the scene.
It's interesting. Yeah, the beginning of this book absolutely downloaded into my head just like that in a day. And I have never had that experience before or since. I mean, I've had flights of inspiration where I'm on a roll with a section of a book, but I haven't had that experience of a beginning of a book coming to me whole cloth. And that was very strange. I was here in this house over there. I have a little conservatory there that looks out at a river. So it's beautiful all seasons. Right now, it's kind of dry and desiccated and just about bursting into spring. But I was over there, and that beginning, so it is in a real cave, Ruby Falls in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is one of those caves that has an underground waterfall, hence the name. And our little girl Ruby is there, and naturally it's a double entendre. And she's there with her father, and they turn off the lights, which is what they do in certainly in Ruby Falls. I mean, I can't imagine they do it anymore, but they sure did it when I went there as a kid. So the lights are off, and she cannot tell where this waterfall is in relationship to her person. And she's clutching onto her father and trying not to move her feet because she's terrified she will fall in. And she's trying to be a big girl and a brave girl, and her father lets go of her hand. And the lights come back on, and he's gone. And it is this moment in time where there are no cameras, there are cell phone records, there are no, credit cards, anything. There's no way of tracking how this kid got in this cave. And the tour guides are kind of scratching their heads because obviously she didn't come in alone, but they didn't pay any attention to who she came in with. So they don't know what to do with her. And they haul her up to the gift shop and plunk her on a bench until finally they call the police when nobody gets her. And about 10 o'clock that night, her mother, who the family had been visiting from the Midwest, I am a Midwesterner, I'm a Michigander specifically. So the family had been visiting Tennessee from Michigan, visiting their Southern relatives, which is a common thing in Michigan. And the mom figures out about 10 o'clock that night that her husband and her daughter cannot just be out to dinner. She calls the police station. They match up the child in their custody, and the mother and the daughter are grounded in Chattanooga, Tennessee for the rest of the summer as the mother deals with the search and the inquisition into what happened. And the child is kind of catatonic. She is in a state of shock, really, in a bedroom, lying down. So that's the beginning of the book, and that just came.
Well, you did it brilliantly, and when you just said that she's in a state of shock, and the very last line in the opening, in the prologue, which is called "Then," which I think is amazing, is just her state of what she's doing, and it packs a punch. I don't want to read anything that to give anything away, but I think when your readers get to that moment, like just a couple of pages in, it really sets the stage for what's going to happen and what we're moving into with Ruby, who becomes Eleanor.
Well, so if anybody out there has family in the South, or if you're from the South, my dad's family was all from the South, and they really loved a good middle name. My dad was William Earl Goodrich, and he went by Earl. His brother was Elmer Dale Goodrich, and he went by Dale. I won't go on, but you get the picture. That's the way it was done. And so her name is Eleanor Ruby Russell. And as a little girl, she's called Ruby. It was really her father's choice, this name. And so she ditches the name as she grows up and becomes a young actress on a soap opera. I'm not sure where I got that. And she goes by Eleanor Russell because she finds it so much more sophisticated.
And maybe because she's a little bit trying to maybe move away from what happened to her as Ruby. That's how I took it as a reader. But
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I love the part, I love the part where, the way you write setting, and it certainly was true in Finding Mrs. Ford, the way you wrote about Watch Hill, which is one of my favorite places in the world, and I know it's one of yours too. And it's it just is so vivid, and you read the book and you feel you're there. Same thing with Ruby Falls. I mean, I felt like I was in that cave. And then when you go to Los Angeles, and we've both lived in Los Angeles, the way you write about the city and the little details and the Hollywood Hills, and just you captured that, all of it, like the romance of it, the difficulties of it, the disappointments and of it, and the industry a part of it. And I just I love the way you write setting. It's almost as if and I wonder, which comes first to you? Like, obviously in this story, and you're drawing on your time as an actress and you were out there, but did that inform what was going to happen to Ruby? Was it partly because you needed to write about Los Angeles, or did she tell you, I'm going to Los Angeles, or both?
Both, but you've really hit on a really incredible nugget. So I lived in LA as a young actress. And of course, we are all familiar with what Hollywood looks like because we've all watched 100+ years of American cinema. So it's an iconic place to everybody. And Ruby Falls, in many ways, is a love letter to Daphne du Maurier's book, Rebecca. It doesn't play out in the same way. It is not a retelling of Rebecca, but it takes certain key setup elements of Rebecca. I mean, when Ruby grows up and becomes Eleanor, and she's on the soap opera, and she's written out, which is a very nice way of saying fired. She goes to Europe and meets a mysterious stranger, marries him without knowing him. And that is very evocative of Rebecca. If you remember the beginning of the book or the movie, the young woman was in Europe and met Max de Winter and married him without knowing him. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of foundational, which is similar. And if you think about the first line of Rebecca, it's
last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again.
That's exactly right. And that sentence, there's so many things in that sentence. You know right away, Manderley's a dreamy place. You know right away, she's not there now. There's a feeling you get in that one sentence that she can't be there, but wants to be there. But there's also something kind of unreal and forbidding about it. It's a very lush and beautiful sentence, but it's a little spooky. So with LA, I had lived there for 8 years as an actress. And I left in the early 90s. My first husband and I and our 2 children moved to Paris. And, we were briefly back in LA, but we really then made our life again in New York. So I've been on the East Coast for a very long time. And in the years that I was away from Los Angeles, 4 people who were very, very close to me died. Not all at once, obviously, but my agent, Howard Goldberg, died. 2 very close girlfriends died of different cancers at different times. And my youthful boyfriend of those years died in his mid-40s. And we had been long apart, but they were all very important people to me. So I went back to LA when my youngest daughter moved there. And this was about 2015. And this book was not quite germinating yet. But Hollywood felt like a haunted place to me. And if you live in a place for a long time, like I'm here in this town in Connecticut outside of New York, and I drive by the library every day or the CVS or whatever I drive by. And even if something happened in that location, like, well, I don't have, I'm married, but like, let's say your boyfriend broke up with you, or you got that terrible phone call that somebody is not well. If you drive by that place every day, it sort of dulls that emotional content. But if you go back to a place, I'm very long-winded on this and I'll speed it up. If you go back to a place from which you've been absent for a long time, and it can just be like an overflow of loss. And, this was the place where that happened. And this was the place where that happened. That informs Ruby Falls. So I think because I'd started going back to LA when this book started percolating in my head, it was the only place I could think of setting it that would have that same slightly unreal and dreamlike feeling, while being very particularly vivid about exactly which streets are where and so on. And I'll shut up now because I've gone on very long about it.
No, that's so wonderful. And I know everybody can relate to that. That is so beautifully put and true, that places conjure up the past, and they conjure up, experiences and wonderful times and terrible times. And sometimes this will happen to me where you'll completely block something out. And then there's some sort of sensory memory. You'll be walking down a path and you'll smell beach roses, or, the light will change and it all comes back to you, and then it's there and you can't get rid of it. Sometimes it's like,
Well, and
it's
actors
haunting.
use that. That is a technique of acting. I mean, that is what actors do. They carry that thing in the pocket. They carry that polished stone that their father gave them, or they carry that letter, or they carry, actors use things. They use sense memory to suddenly, kickstart themselves into an emotional state that they might not be in when they walked into the studio that day with their coffee.
So actually, that's an interesting question. How much of your acting technique and of that, of what you just described, do you use as a writer? And and I don't think I've ever asked you this, but did you study acting or writing? How much of it is instinctive, and how do the two kind of merge together?
Yeah, so in terms of studying, the trajectory of my life as a student, so I was a French and Italian major in college. I spent part of my junior year abroad, and I was a dance minor, and I went to a tiny women's college in Ohio that was so small that I was able to be a very active participant in the theater and act in plays without being a theater major. I think when you get to bigger universities, you stick more within your department. But I was able to kind of, bop around a little bit. And so I did a lot of writing in college, but I was not a student of writing. I was a student of language, and I love language. And I always say that I learned my English grammar through other languages because it just suddenly starts to click and make sense. When I got to New York, I came to dance because I danced in a film that came to Cleveland, Ohio, which sounds kind of, made up, but it's true. It was a big studio picture, and I was hired as a background dancer. And I came to New York to audition for the choreographer and was not cast in the thing that he had told me about. But when I spent about a year seriously pursuing dance. And when you're pursuing dance, you do nothing but, well, you don't use the word study, you use the term take class. So you take class all day, every day at these dance studios up and down Broadway. But when I realized, I'm not going to cut it as a dancer, I did start classes with a fellow by the name of Gene Frankel, who had been a big Broadway director. He was a wonderful teacher. I studied with him for a number of years. And then I studied with Warren Robertson, who was, if anybody out there is listening to this, who studied with Warren, he was phenomenal. Who was in my class? I remember Grace Slick was in the class.
No way.
Everybody was
Oh
in
my
the
God.
class. Famous actors, models, singers like Grace Slick. Remember her? She had that
Gracie Slick, of
yeah,
course. She was an airplane.
No, not
No?
Grace Slick.
Oh, I was going to say, I never
No.
thought of her as being
Of course, she was in. Who was the one? She was tall, black, with
Grace Jones.
Grace Jones.
Also equally cool, or at least almost as cool as Grace Slick. I was like,
Very
either
different.
way, though.
Grace Jones was in the class.
Either of those Graces are very cool.
And Warren had been a devotee of a particular guru. I think he was a devotee of the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, the one who was up in Oregon.
Yeah.
So he used very unusual techniques in the class. And You know, a lot of emotional expression. And then in LA, I studied with Milton Katselas. He's another very famous teacher. So I had three really important teachers along the way. And actors often continue to study even as they're working. It's just kind of part of the process where you can try out other things. And then in terms of writing, in the 90s, my editorial years really did feel a lot like writing school for me, because I was, you know, writers are observers. And when you're called in to edit other people's work, it's really hard. And you better think long and hard about what you like and what you don't, and why you think it works and why you think it doesn't work. So it was, I think, a crystallizing process. And then after that, I've spent the last 20 years in a couple of writing groups that have been really helpful for me. And that process of being in the writing groups, what that has done, because I'm in very nice writing groups with very nice people, talented people, but nice people. They're not trying to decimate each other. So in that process, I started to get a handle on that people did respond to the way I said things, and that I could allow myself to say things in the way I wanted to say them. Because as you know, I mean, you're such a wonderful and accomplished writer, and your words are so beautiful. You have to have the confidence to say it in your way. The last thing that should happen to a writer is having someone come in and try to change the way you do things. Do you know what I mean?
I do, and yes, gaining that confidence takes a bit. And I remember when I first began, and like, I don't know, my way. I wrote short stories, and I would submit them to magazines, and back then you would send them out in a self-addressed stamped envelope, and no sooner would I put them in the mailbox than it would come back in my own handwriting with a printed rejection slip. And of course, the first place you sent a short story, it's probably still the same, but it was certainly back then, was the New Yorker. And for some reason, because I'm from Connecticut, I'm in Connecticut like you are, Deborah, which is kind of sad we're not in Minneapolis at maybe,
I know.
but because Brendan Gill was the drama critic at the New Yorker, and I suppose because he was from Connecticut too, one of the fiction editor must have handed him one of my stories and said, "What do you think?" Which is flattering in itself. But I remember he invited me down to New York. He called me dear child, come to New York, and come to the Hideaway, which was his office in the New Yorker building, which was 25 West 43rd at the time. And he took me to lunch at the Algonquin, and we sat in a banquette in the Rose Room, and I was absolutely floored. I mean, this 19-year-old from Connecticut who's having lunch with Brendan Gill. And at the table next to us was William Shawn, who was the editor-in-chief of the New Yorker. And Brendan whispered about him the entire time, said, "Watch out, all he ever orders is chicken soup, or sometimes he orders oatmeal." I was like, I can't believe this is happening. But anyway, he told me the most important thing a writer can do is to find her voice. And that's what you're talking about, really, is like gaining that confidence. But the way to do it is you have to find your voice. And I think that the conundrum is that as a young writer, you don't trust your own voice. And with any luck, you're reading things you love, and you're just reading nonstop. And I think that's so important in absorbing other people's visions and techniques, and without even thinking those words. I feel like that's too cerebral. It's just it's an internal thing. But then eventually, you see what they do and how they might do it consistently, and then you start to trust yourself. And I think that's, for me anyway, that was how I went from 1,000, all my rejection slips, to eventually not even an acceptance, but a rejection slip with a tiny note on it that said, "Try us again." And that was like getting, like a very high mark. And it gave me a little confidence to keep going. But isn't it interesting, the paths we take to get to, where we are now with books out? It's wonderful.
It's an extraordinary journey. And one of my favorite stories, which I think is very important to share with people because everybody's at a different place on this journey. For the publication of Ruby Falls in hardcover last year, my publisher took one of those triple electronic billboards in Times Square, which was
That's
really
amazing.
stunning for me. And some girlfriends and I from Connecticut drove into Times Square, and it was April the 27th of last year. So there was nobody in Times Square. Every theater was shuttered. Every restaurant was closed. You know, there was the very odd straggler there on the sidewalk. But as I stood under those three billboards, you know, getting my picture taken, pointing up, it was at 1515 Broadway, which is the Minskoff Theater. That is the door I entered 40 years before to audition for that choreographer from
No.
the movie.
Oh,
Which,
how moving. Oh,
and I didn't get that. And I thought, boy, if a little angel had tapped me on the shoulder 40 years before and said, listen, darling, this isn't going to work out for you, but don't worry. 40 years from now,
you will
you'll
have
be
your name
back.
in lights.
But
And you know, your readers can go to your social media, I think, and probably find that picture because I remember when you posted it, it was so thrilling to see that.
well, and candidly, that it was a once in a lifetime experience, I think, for me, because normally a billboard in Times Square costs quite a pretty penny. But in the middle of COVID, it was just this crazy moment in time where they couldn't give them away. And I'm so glad
Deborah,
I did it.
you know,
No
leave
one was
that part
really,
out.
yeah, no one was there, but it was fun to have the photographs of it.
It's
Yeah.
fantastic. It really is. But it is, I love what you just said though about, you know, if somebody could have told young Deborah, you know, like that any of this was going to happen. And I think that's really important to say for any of our readers, but also any writers in the audience, you know, that might be wanting to do their own work or even, I think even just like life has been hard the last few years. I think it's even in general, it's hard for writers just because there's so much uncertainty and you're drawing from so much that's intense and internal. But I think that that's the thing. It's like to keep going and without being Pollyanna and saying it's all going to work out okay, but just kind of have some kind of trust and faith in it. When you, for whatever reason, I just had this, maybe because we're talking about film and acting and writing, but do you know this? You know the African Queen, the film with
Yes. Oh, yes.
right?
Yeah.
So one of the most inspiring scenes in any movie ever to me is toward the end of the film when Katharine Hepburn, Rosie, and Charlie are in the African Queen and they're going down the river to try to blow up the enemy ship. And you know it's a journey against all odds, and they go down this river and they encounter so many difficulties, but they're doing it and they're making it, and they get all the way down. They're almost there, and they end up in some kind of channel that's all reeds and it's all overgrown, and they just get stopped dead. And like it's Africa, the heat is killing them. You know the bugs are swarming. They have no water, and they lie down on the deck of the boat to die in each other's arms. And then all of a sudden, as they're lying there, the camera pans up and you can see that they're in this little twisty, turny canal that is only yards from the lake, but they don't know it. And so they've given up and they're lying there to die. And then the rains come and it floats the boat and they float into the lake, and it's all, you know, and the movie ends in a crescendo of amazement. But I feel like that is how life is, and writing is that way too, that you're stuck in the reeds, like you are stuck in the reeds, there's no way out, and somehow here we are, and you had a billboard in Times Square.
No, we often can't see the way out, or we often the way out isn't always the way we think we want the way out to be. We've talked about that too before, that I life took many twists and turns along that river, if you will, to get to this point. And I think everyone's life is like that. But of course, when you're young, I mean, you think about talking to a teenage girl whose boyfriend just broke up with her, for example. There's nothing you can say to convince her that life will go on. She will get over him, that, he isn't the only one to ever come along. But
It's so true. And that kind of makes me want to ask you more about the trauma aspect of Ruby Falls, which I think is extraordinary. I think it's so powerful, so riveting, something many people will relate to, I believe, in ways that are, I mean, because I think it's very subjective. Trauma is subjective, but in this case, it was extreme. And I don't want to give anything away, but her reaction to it, what happens to her in terms of PTSD and the way she reacts. And I will say dissociation is a part, which I think for anyone who's really been seriously traumatized, they know what that is or how that works. But I think that is one of the most powerful parts of the book, Deborah. And you do a real service, I think, to people who've experienced trauma.
I don't know if I read it or heard it on the news or where I saw this, but someone was describing sexual assault. And of course, that's not the subject of my book. I want to be clear. Right. But that was the subject this person was talking about. And the person was describing this completely disconnected order of magnitude between two human beings, that the person who's assaulted, let's say a woman, and just in this case, she is forever changed by what happened. Whereas often he, the assaulter, all he was doing was scratching an itch. Mm-hmm. And just the callousness of that, that's exactly the way this person put it. And it just gave me a chill of recognition in exactly what you're saying. We're all going through this life, and often we share an experience with another human being, and one person might be broken by it, and the other person might not be affected at all. Mm-hmm. There are countless variables that can cause that discrepancy, but it is this girl being abandoned in this cave at 6 years old is the seminal event of her life. It is shattering. And that is, I think the best word I can think of. And she patches herself together very well, but there is this brokenness inside of her. And I once heard someone say, talking about brokenness, they were talking about Japanese pottery, and I don't know if you've seen it. It's porcelain, but if it breaks, they paint a seam of gold leaf on it, and so the broken part actually becomes the strongest part. And I think that's a great metaphor for surviving trauma, but I think people have varying abilities to do that. And there are different moments in time where people did or didn't get as much help, but that is very much a part of the book, how she copes with that thing that happened.
It is, and it's really incredible. And again, it goes back to the cover, just the fragmented aspect of the cover is so it has echoes of the story and of the
let's talk about a book you wrote a while ago, The Silver Boat. I mean, that's very much it's a different outcome, but it's a similar idea of a father disappearing and leaving this hole in the understanding of not one but three daughters in the case of that book. And each woman, because we meet them as women, each one of them is trying to keep her life together in her own way. I was really struck by the similarities in those two books thematically.
Oh, I'm flattered to hear that. That's really nice. Thank you. Yeah, I loved that book. Um,
Well,
you know,
you delved into that thing too. That kind of childhood abandonment is rough. You know, kids don't really have the emotional tools to understand. I don't know if adults do either.
probably not. Abandonment is hard for sure. That is, why am I thinking of the last line of The Great Gatsby? The green light and borne back ceaselessly into the past. I mean, that's what childhood trauma does, what trauma does, really. It brings you, it just, it's like a boat against the tide. You're being borne back into the past, and it takes a lot of, I think it takes a lot of effort and work to, when you've really been truly traumatized, to uh, get through it and get to a healthy place. And luckily, as you mentioned, there are more resources now. But uh, one of the things that like always strikes me about Ruby Falls, but the way you wrote about Orlando, who is the man that Eleanor meets in Europe, and he's so compelling and charming and handsome, and he just sweeps her off her feet. And you wrote this thing that is so chilling. Like, I think I've had nightmares about it, Deborah. The part where he becomes a different person while she's
Mm,
married to him. All of a sudden, he becomes a completely different person. It's like the mask comes off. And
yeah.
it, that is absolutely, you do it. It's really wonderfully done. Like scarily, horrifyingly, but chillingly done. That I think if it's happened to any of our viewers, they will know exactly what I'm talking about, where it's,
Well, that's that experience of a person presenting as one thing and then revealing a very different side. And Orlando is very quiet in his in the way he turns a little bit on Eleanor. He's
right.
not,
It's gradual. It's gradual.
and it's just funny little words or phrases he says that are just not. There's something that he's removed himself a little bit, and it's jarring to her, but it's subtle enough that she questions herself, and that's often what happens.
That's the worst part.
uh, Emotional abuse,
But right.
physical abuse.
And I feel like you did it in a way that it makes you wonder, at what point is he doing it purposely, where he knows that he's torturing her psychologically? Because that is a part of it, and it does do that thing where it makes you wonder, am I right about this? Like, am I reading this right? Like, he couldn't have meant it that way,
Well, that's the beauty of passive aggression, because if a person says to you, well, don't you look nice tonight? Did you lose weight?
right.
So there can be a reaction of, well, gosh, what did I look like before? What are you saying? And
Right.
if you say, what do you mean? The person could just say, what? I just said you look nice. You look beautiful.
It's true.
So he goes not into that specific, but he goes into that zone of the barbs they're deniable.
Right.
That's when you throw out little barbs that are deniable.
It's like, what? And
Yeah,
then that turns it back on you. So then again,
yeah,
you're doubly wrong. It's like, first of all, you're taking it the wrong way. And
right.
then, yeah, you're so sensitive. That's
Well,
really
he says at one point, he says something to her, and at her reaction, and he tells her, he said, I'm really disappointed in you. I don't know what you must think of me.
right.
Those aren't his exact words. So she's mortified and feels terrible because her thoughts are not correct about him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You and we could go, I mean, this would be there's so much more to say. And I will say this, because I feel like maybe it would help if anybody's watching and they are going through this. Um, you and I have a mutual friend who is wonderful, and he is trying to help a man who's going through a type of emotional and psychological abuse. And I recommended a book to him called The Verbally Abusive Relationship by Patricia Evans. And that was recommended to me by the head of a domestic violence clinic. And it is really powerful. And so if anyone is going through in a relationship like Deborah has written, as part of Ruby Falls, not all of it, it's a really helpful book. And this friend of ours, Deborah, has passed it on to his friends. So hopefully it will
That's
help.
a great resource. I remember someone told me about a book many years ago. I don't even know if it's still in print. The Gentle Art of Verbal Self-Defense, which is a similar way of kind of, acknowledge what's not really appropriate to say.
Right. Which it's really hard sometimes, especially when you're in it, because I always think of like emotional abuse as like a lobster who's put into a pot of cold water and it's slowly brought to the boil and you don't know what's happening. It's very gradual, and then suddenly you're a different person or you're a boiled lobster. Excuse me. It's allergies.
Yeah.
It's that time of year.
Well, I had COVID a couple weeks ago, so
yes. How are you doing?
I feel like I'm COVID Teflon now, but maybe that is a little naive. I should be careful. We're doing fine. My husband and I had it. We are fine.
Good.
We're doing okay. It was like a bad cold.
Aw. So are you okay? So let me ask you. Can we talk about Reef Road a little bit?
Yes.
I don't want to say too much, but Deborah has a new novel that I've been very privileged to read in galleys, and it's incredible. She does in Reef Road for Palm Beach what she did for LA and Ruby Falls and Watch Hill and Finding Mrs. Ford. And again, you'll read the book and you're in Palm Beach. And just the little details again, the things that I mentioned to you when I first read it, just capture it so perfectly. And that's an amazing story too. And again, you go back and forth in time and there's an old case that becomes very important. And so where are we at? Where are you at with Reef Road?
So Reef Road is a book that really came about in the pandemic lockdown. I began researching a true crime, the murder of my mother's best friend in Pittsburgh in 1948. And, there are reams of material now on the internet, and I was able to get the coroner's report and all that. And I didn't want to write a nonfiction book about that. That's just, I'm a great believer that you can put the truth you want to put into fiction without become too obsessed with factual minutia. So it's a fictionalized look at a writer who's researching the murder of her mother's best friend. And, there's this syndrome among people who have been kind of next door to acts of extreme violence. It has an effect on them as well. I mean, you think about Dominic Dunn, who became one of our premier reporters of murder trials after his own daughter was murdered. Or you think about Michelle McNamara, who wrote I'll Be Gone in the Dark, and they made the TV miniseries about the solving of the Golden State Killer. She had had a friend and neighbor murdered. So that's kind of a thing, and that's what I was really interested in drilling down on. Not so much the minutia of the murder, but the way that it's like a stone thrown in a lake. It just continues to have this effect unless people do, like we said earlier with trauma, do conscious work to stop it. Mm-hmm. So that is part of the book. And then there's more of a kind of driven thriller about a woman whose husband disappears with the children in the pandemic. But it's all set in Palm Beach. And it was interesting for me because I was there when the shutdown happened. And I just remember it being very hot and very buggy. It was buggier than normal, but it was also quiet, but there were these constraints, but there was this weird freedom, like you could go out and ride your bike all alone, nobody was on the road. And I thought it was a good underpinning for a thriller because it's a little bit like wartime. There are certain limitations and constraints that are just there. And so the characters are pushing against all of that. So we will have a printed galley probably by around July, and the book comes out January 10th of 2023. It got pushed back. You know, there's this crazy thing now with all these supply chain delays, which we're all hearing about. And my publisher wanted to turn it around a little faster. I'm actually happy with this publication date in 2023 because 23 is 75 years after the real murder.
Oh, that's
on which
incredible.
it's based. Yeah.
I love hearing about your research of that, and just sorry about the connection with your family. I mean, even though it's a generation away, I know it's affected you.
Yeah.
Clearly, it did. I mean, it comes through in the writing. But
Yeah, it does have an effect. And yeah, I won't say any more about that, but I really wanted to explore that. And I think a lot of people can relate to that because, there are these crazy things that happen.
right, that's for sure. And how about are you beginning to think about the next one, or I think maybe you're even started the next one?
I did. I
Okay.
did. It's very unformed. I started it and then I got very immersed in revisions and some other details of Reef Road. I've got 10 plus pages of notes. I've kind of written a little bit of a beginning, but that was triggered, and I won't say too much about it. It was triggered by an email that I got from someone I don't remember. And it was an email that had a lot of particular details that, I got to thinking about memory
Mhm.
and truth and
Mm.
all of that stuff. So,
Oh, that's fascinating. I can't
yeah.
wait to read it. To read whenever you're ready to show me. I'm always happy.
Okay.
I'm so
And what
excited
about
to hear
you?
you.
You said you were writing at the Ocean House last week.
Yes, my favorite place to write when yes, Deborah and I both have that in common. But I was writing, working on a short story and working on a new young adult novel.
Oh, great.
And then also, planning ahead slightly to the next thriller. So
Okay.
yeah, I see Annie's with us.
I'm back. I'm back. I just wanted to say that I'm loving hearing about the upcoming projects that both of you have, and we're kind of reaching the end of our time. So, very last chance to ask questions. I know we've got some people out there, but if all of your questions have been answered by Luanne's wonderful question asking, that is totally fine. I want to remind everyone that I have a link to Ruby Falls and a link to books by Luanne Rice, both in the chat. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit and watch this conversation with us this evening. It has been really, really wonderful. And it's just great to see you two clearly have such a wonderful connection and to hear your stories. And the story about the billboard was really just amazing.
Kind of crazy.
Yeah,
Really.
absolutely. So, yeah, I will. I see we don't have any questions, so I will just say thank you so much to you both. Thank you for your support of independent bookstores like ours, and we hope to have you here in person someday.
That would be great.
I would love it too. Thank you so much, Annie.
Thank
Yes.
you, Annie. Thank
And
you.
Deborah.
See you
Have a
soon.
great evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Gotta figure out how to